Hello, friends. Today's podcast question is a heavy one and a bit of a sad one, but an important one for us to cover nonetheless. And this question says, when is the right time to talk with my child about abortion? And how can I explain it in developmentally appropriate and biblically accurate terms? So this question actually includes two separate questions. The first question is about the timing of beginning this conversation. And the second question is about the actual how to do it. Now, talking with our children about abortion is not something that we're going to look forward to because abortion is just this terrible sin that our nation is committing and has been committing for so long, but it is a really important conversation to have with our children. So that's the question that we're going to dive down deep into today on the Foundation Worldview Podcast, where we seek to answer your questions so that you can equip the children that God has placed in your care to carefully evaluate every idea they encounter and understand the truth of the biblical worldview. Now, when we think about the concept of abortion, this is a concept that many Christian parents try to hide from their children. And in some ways, that is understandable because abortion is the murder, the killing of innocent lives. However, because we live in a nation that makes abortion illegal, it makes it legal, sadly. And because it is so prevalent, it is important that we have this conversation with our children. And it's important that we phrase it as it being a corruption of something that God designed to be beautiful, which is human life. So as we think through the first question, the timing behind this, when is the right time to start this conversation? I think that somewhere around the age of 10 is the right time, that we don't want to have this conversation too early. Probably we don't want to have this conversation with a 6-year-old. That's probably too much for them at that age to bear. But we want to have it before they're going to be faced with it in culture. So this conversation, like I said, should start around the age of 10. Maybe you're going to start it around the age of 9 or the age of 8, depending on where your child is developmentally. Or again, depending on where they are developmentally, you could wait until they are 11. But because this is such a pressing cultural issue, I really think that children need to understand it from a biblical perspective before they reach the age of 12. I mean, just from my own personal experience, that I know that by the time I was 12, I had heard from conversations both at school and at church about friends' older siblings having had abortions. And so even if you're thinking, oh, well, my child is homeschooled, like they're not going to be exposed to this, even just with relationships at church, and it's important for our children to have relationships, sadly, they may find out about the realities of abortion. And I think it's really important that we be the first ones to have these conversations with our children so that we make sure that we're there to answer any questions, to talk through any of their fears about this, and then also to help them understand this from a biblical perspective. Now, if we're thinking about talking with our children, somewhere between the ages of 8 and 11 about the reality of abortion, obviously, they first need to have a biblical understanding of the concept of sex and reproduction, that they need to have that foundation before we can introduce, this corruption of God's good design. So if you haven't yet had the first of many sex talks with your children, I highly recommend that you check out our mini series here at Foundation Worldview called The Talk Made Easy. It's 3 short videos. Each of them is under 10 minutes. You can either watch those videos on your own and use the language that we use in that to have the conversations with your children, or you can watch these videos alongside your children to let us say the uncomfortable things first. And the first video is on body parts, just the difference between male and female anatomy. The second video is on sex, explaining just the basic mechanics of sex. And the third video is on reproduction, just the basics of how babies are made. So highly recommend you check out that series, The Talk Made Easy. You can get it for only $15 at the Foundation Worldview website. Okay, so the timing. We need to have this conversation sometime between the ages of 8 and 11. 10 is usually a good marker, but you can go a little bit earlier, a little bit later. Now the how to. How do we have this conversation in developmentally appropriate and biblically accurate terms. I think the first thing that we need to do when having this conversation is just review with our children that God's good design for sex within marriage leads to children. So start out with the positive. We always want to start out with the positive of what God's good design is. So remind your child that God designed sex for marriage. Sex leads to children. And talk about all the blessings that have come along with having a family. Talk about how all of the members of your family have relationship with one another, that most of the time, usually you enjoy spending time together. Talk through some of the wonderful memories that you have made together. Talk about how there's people around to share meals with, to learn more about God with, to serve together, to do fun things together. Just any blessings that you see of having a family. And if you're watching this video on YouTube, just in the comments, just write down some of the things that you see as blessings of having a family. And when you start this conversation with your child, you would want to bring up as just one of the incredible blessings of having children and having a family. So that's the first part of this conversation. Then the second part is then we want to introduce how sin has corrupted God's good design. Now, if you have already taken your children through our God's Good Design curriculum here at Foundation Worldview, they will have all of the necessary groundwork to have this conversation. Just review with them that they have already learned that sin corrupts God's good design. Talk through some of the corruptions that were highlighted in that curriculum. If you haven't taken your child through God's good design, highly recommend that you take them through that, because that curriculum lays the foundation for understanding God's good design for gender, for sexuality, for marriage, for family. And it also lays the groundwork for having a biblical understanding of all of the different corruptions of God's good design that they're going to face in the world around them. Whether that be sex outside of marriage, whether that be pornography, whether that be abuse, whether that be homosexuality or transgenderism, or now in this conversation, abortion. So highly recommend you take your children through that. If your child is over the age of 9, so if they're 10 on up, that curriculum is going to be too basic for them. So what I would recommend that you do is just take them through the different scripture passages that we take kids through in the lesson in God's Good Design, where we teach them that sin corrupts God's good design. So the passages that we take children through in that one lesson are Genesis 2, verses 16 and 17, Genesis 3, verse 17, Romans 5, verse 12, Romans 3, verse 23, James 1, verse 14, and Romans 6, verse 23. So just take your child through these passages and discuss how sin has corrupted God's good design. That God's design is inherently good, but sin has corrupted it. So once your child has that foundation, then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to explain that one of the ways that sin corrupts God's good design is by people taking sex outside of marriage. So rather than sex being the way that a husband and wife confirm the promise, the covenant of marriage that they have made with one another and before God, and having it be the way that they're reminded of that covenant and reminded of their love for one another, people take sex outside of the covenant of marriage. They have sex with whoever they want without making the promise of marriage. Okay, so talk through that with your child, and then say that, God designed the good gift of sex within marriage to lead to children. But when sex is taken outside of marriage, it still leads to children. So sometimes when people take sex outside of marriage, the woman becomes pregnant with a baby and she's not married. Now, at this point, I think it's really important to explain that even when children are conceived outside of the marriage covenant, they are a good gift from God. And what you can do is you can read Psalm 139, verses 13 through 16 with your child. And these verses say, "For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them." So read through that passage and talk about what does it say about children. It says that children are fearfully and wonderfully made, that God knew them when they were being developed in their mother's womb, that God had ordained all of the days that he has for them, even before one of them came to be. So talk through how even if sex is taken outside of marriage, the children that are conceived in that union are still a blessing, a gift from God. Then you're going to want to talk about actually abortion. And so you'll want to explain that when people enter into sex without making the promise of marriage, they're often thinking selfishly, that they're not thinking, how can I give the best of myself to this person? They're thinking of what they can get. And so therefore, when they find out that they're pregnant, they may be thinking selfishly about the baby too. That rather than viewing that baby as a gift from God, they're disappointed that they have a baby that they didn't want because they weren't planning on having a baby. So they might be thinking selfishly about that baby and thinking that they don't want that baby. Or when they find out that they're pregnant, they might be feeling really scared because they weren't expecting a baby, and they might be scared of what it will look like to raise a baby when they're not married. And so instead of loving and caring for that baby, they decide to get rid of it. They decide to kill it. And you can explain that sadly, this is something that is legal in our country, that this is something that some doctors do, that they will help the woman get rid of her baby. And you can explain that this is very sad, that this is a sin against God, it's a sin against this baby, but that this sin is nothing new, that this is something that is to be expected in a world that has turned away from God. And a passage that you can take your children to is Leviticus chapter 20, verses 1 through 5. And you can explain to your child that this is part of the law that God gave to the nation of Israel. And in this passage, it says, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, 'Say to the people of Israel, any one of the people of Israel, or of the strangers who sojourn in Israel, who gives any of his children to Molech, shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. I myself will set my face against that man and cut him off from among his people, because he has given one of his children to Molech to make my sanctuary unclean and to profane my holy name. And if the people of the land do at all close their eyes to that man when he gives one of his children to Molech and do not punish him to death, then I will set my face against that man and against his clan and will cut them off from among their people, him and all who follow him in his whoring after Molech.'" So you can read this passage with your child and you can explain that God gave this law to the nation of Israel as they were about to enter the promised land. And the Canaanites were currently living in the promised land. And one of the things that the Canaanites would do at this time is they would offer their children up as a sacrifice to a false god, Molech. And so even though these children were born, so it was a little bit different than abortion, that this was not children in the womb, these were children who were born, these children would be killed as an offering to Molech. And the reason that the people would do this is either they wanted something that they did not have, or they were scared. For example, maybe they wanted more rain to grow more crops, to become wealthier. So they would sacrifice their child to this god Molech as a way to try to get him to do what they wanted, to give them more rain. Or maybe they were scared. Maybe they were scared that Molech was mad at them. And so they were thinking, he's going to do something bad to me. So they would offer up one of their children to him so that he would no longer be mad at them. So these two motivations of manipulation, which is basically selfishness, or fear, were why people would offer up their children to Molech. And it's the same today. People typically who engage in an abortion, most people who are engaged in this, I know this is not all cases, but in most cases, people either want a life without children, like they don't want children right now. So similar to the person who would just want rain for more crops, they wanted something, so they would offer up their children to get it. People don't want the restraints of children. And so they offer up their child on the altar of their own desires. Or they might be scared. They're in a situation where they don't know how they're going to provide for this child, how they're going to raise this child on their own. So they offer up this child as a sacrifice. They kill it out of their fear. And so we want our children to see this parallel, that what's happening in the abortion culture today in the US, making decisions either driven by selfishness or driven by fear, that this is the same thing that was happening back in the days of the Canaanites when people were offering their children to Molech. And so we want our children to see this is very sad. It's a sin against God, and it's a sin against the child. Now, at this point, you'll want to provide your child with time to ask questions. And, even if they need time to grieve. I know one of my friends, when she was explaining abortion to her son, he was either 8 or 9 years old, and his heart was just broken that he just started sobbing. And he was like, I thought it was illegal to murder people in our country. So she spent, a good part of the closing part of that conversation just comforting him. And now, while you might be listening and thinking like, oh my goodness, how could she bring, so much grief upon her child? Her son's response actually is the right response. That when we think about the millions of babies that are offered on the altar of our selfishness or our fear every year, this is something that should cause us to grieve deeply. So as you're closing this conversation with your child, give them an opportunity to ask questions, to share their thoughts, and then pray with your child. Close this conversation by praying with them. Thank God for the gift of life, that He has given us the gift of babies, and then ask that He would help people in our country realize that sacrificing our children is wrong. It is evil. And then your child might, be a little bit in shock over, this news of what happened, just depending on who they are. This might not affect them really deeply, or it might affect them very deeply. Let them know that they're allowed and they're encouraged to come to you at any time with their questions or their worries or their concerns about this, so that they are reminded that you are a safe place to come to with their questions and their concerns. And then in follow-up conversations, something that you can do, or you could even do this in the initial conversation to kind of not wrap things up positively, because it's really impossible for any conversation that's waking someone up to the horrors of abortion to be a positive conversation, because it's about sin. But to help them understand that there's things that we can do. Discuss with your child what are some things that you can do as a family to be pro-life. So talk about how you can pray. You could pray on a weekly basis or a daily basis that God would open up people's eyes to the truth, that so many people have just been blinded by the God of this age and just don't understand that abortion is murder. You can pray also that abortion becomes illegal. Pray for our state and our federal officials, that they would understand that abortion is murder and that they would work to make it illegal. Pray that God would open up people's eyes to the goodness of His design, that they would understand that sex is a good and beautiful gift and that it was meant to stay within the confines of marriage. Then talk about how, as a family, you can show others that children are a gift, that every time you do something together as a family, that you're showing others God's good design for families. You can talk about, what the crisis pregnancy centers are in your area. You can talk about raising money for them. I know that when I used to live just outside of Chicago, that there was a crisis pregnancy center, that they would come to different churches once a year and they would hand out baby bottles. And for the next month, you would have that baby bottle in your home. And the goal was to fill it up with coins and then to donate that to the crisis pregnancy center. So find out different things like that you could do, or maybe you could have a lemonade stand and have the lemonade stand go to a crisis pregnancy, all the proceeds from the lemonade stand go to a crisis pregnancy center. If you have older children, consider going to a pro-life rally and showing the legislators in your state or the country that there are many people who care about life. Well, as I said at the opening of this podcast, that this is a heavy topic to talk about with our children. We don't want to have the conversation too young, but we also want to make sure that we don't wait too late until our children are exposed to this topic by someone other than us. And then we want to make sure that we're grounding this conversation first in the goodness of God's design, then the understanding that sin corrupts God's good design, the understanding that children, no matter the circumstances of their conception, are a blessing, they are a gift. And then understanding what abortion is, that it's murder and it is exactly like what was happening in the land of Canaan when people were offering their children to Molech. Well, that's a wrap for this episode. But if you have a question that you would like for me to answer on a future Foundation Worldview podcast, you can submit that question by going to foundationworldview.com/podcast. As we wrap up our time together, my prayer for you is that no matter the situation in which you and the children God has placed in your care find yourselves, that you would trust that God is working all things together for your good by using all things to conform you more into the image of his Son. I'll see you next time.